Chapter 6, Part 3 of The Worst Journey in the World, Volume 1, by Apsley Cherry-Garrard. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6, The First Winter, Part 3. Scott had under him this first year in his main party a total of 15 officers and 9 men. These officers may be divided into 3 executive officers and 12 scientific staff, but the distinction is very rough, inasmuch as a scientist such as Wilson was every bit as executive as anybody else, and the executive officers also did much scientific work. I will try here briefly to give the reader some idea of the personality and activities of these men as they work in any ordinary day in the hut. It should be noticed that not all the men we had with us were brought to do sledging work. Some were chosen rather for their scientific knowledge than for their physical or other fitness for sledging. The regular sledgers in this party of officers were Scott, Wilson, Evans, Bowers, Oates, ponies, Mears, dogs, Atkinson, surgeon, Wright, physicist, Taylor, physiographer, Debenham, geologist, Gran and myself, while Day was to drive his motors as far as they would go on the polar journey. This leaves Simpson, who was the meteorologist, and whose observations had of necessity to be continuous. Nelson, whose observations into marine biology, temperatures of sea, salinity, currents and tides came under the same heading, and Ponting, whose job was photography, and whose success in this art everybody recognises. However much of good I may write of Wilson, his many friends in England, those who served with him on the ship or in the hut, and most of all those who had the good fortune to sledge with him, for it is sledging which is far the greatest test, will all be dissatisfied, for I know that I cannot do justice to his value. If you knew him, you could not like him. You simply had to love him. Bill was the salt of the earth. If I were asked what quality it was before others that made him so useful and so lovable, I think I should answer that it was because he never for one moment thought of himself. In this respect also Bowers, of whom I will speak in a moment, was most extraordinary, and in passing may I be allowed to say that this is a most necessary characteristic of a good Antarctic traveller. We had many such officers and seamen, and the success of the expedition was in no small measure due to the general and unselfish way in which personal likes and dislikes, wishes or tastes, were ungrudgingly subordinated to the common weal. Wilson and Pennell set an example of expedition first, and the rest nowhere, which others followed ungrudgingly. It pulled us through more than one difficulty which might have led to friction. Wilson was a man of many parts. He was Scott's right-hand man. He was the expedition's chief of the scientific staff. He was a doctor of St. George's Hospital, and a zoologist specialising in vertebrates. His published work on whales, penguins and seals, contained in the scientific report of the Discovery Expedition, is still the best available, and makes excellent reading even to the non-scientist. On the outward journey of the Terra Nova he was still writing up his work for the Royal Commission on grouse disease, the published report of which he never lived to see. But those who knew him best will probably remember Wilson by his water-colour paintings, rather than by any other form of his many-sided work. As a boy his father sent him away on rambling holidays, the only condition being that he should return with a certain number of drawings. I have spoken of the drawings which he made when sledging, or when otherwise engaged away from painting facilities, as at Hut Point. He brought back to winter quarters a notebook filled with such sketches of outlines and colours, of sunsets behind the western mountains, of lights reflected in the freezing sea or in the glass houses of the ice foot, of the steam clouds on Erebus by day and of the aurora australis by night. Next door to Scott he rigged up for himself a table consisting of 2 venesta cases on end, supporting a large drawing board some 4 feet square. On this he set to work systematically to paint the effects which he had seen and noted. He painted with his paper wet, and necessarily therefore he worked quickly. An admirer of Ruskin, he wished to paint what he saw as truly as possible. If he failed to catch the effect he wished, he tore up the picture, however beautiful the result he had obtained. There is no doubt as to the faithfulness of his colouring. The pictures recalled then, and will still recall now in intimate detail, the effects which we saw together. As to the accuracy of his drawing, it is sufficient to say that in the Discovery Expedition Scott wrote on his southern journey,
Wilson is the most indefatigable person. When it is fine and clear, at the end of our fatiguing days he will spend 2 or 3 hours seated in the door of the tent, sketching each detail of the splendid mountainous coast scene to the west. His sketches are most astonishingly accurate. I have tested his proportions by actual angular measurement, and found them correct." In addition to the drawings of land, pack, icebergs and barrier, the primary object of which was scientific and geographical, Wilson has left a number of paintings of atmospheric phenomena, which are not only scientifically accurate, but are also exceedingly beautiful. Of such are the records of auroral displays, parhelions, paraselene, lunar halos, fog bows, iridescent clouds, and refracted images of mountains and mirage generally. If you look at a picture of a parhelion by Wilson, not only can you be sure that the mock suns, circles and shafts appeared in the sky as they are shown on the paper, but you can also rest assured that the number of degrees between, say, the sun and the outer ring of light were in fact such as he has represented them. You can also be certain in looking at his pictures that if cirrus clouds is shown, then cirrus and not stratus cloud was in the sky. If it is not shown, then the sky was clear. It is accuracy such as this which gives an exceptional value to work viewed from a scientific standpoint. Mention should also be made of the paintings and drawings made constantly by Wilson for the various specialists on the expedition whenever they wished for colour records of their specimens. In this connection the paintings of fish and various parasites are especially valuable. I am not specially qualified to judge Wilson from the artistic point of view, but if you want accuracy of drawing, truth and colour, and a reproduction of the soft and delicate atmospheric effects which obtain in this part of the world, then you have them here. Whatever may be said of the painting as such, it is undeniable that an artist of this type is of inestimable value to an expedition which is doing scientific and geographical work in a little known part of the earth. Wilson himself set a low value on his artistic capacity. We used to discuss what Turner would have produced in a land which offered colour effects of such beauty. If we urged him to try and paint some peculiar effect, and he felt that to do so was beyond his powers, he made no scruple of saying so. His colour is clear, his brushwork clean, and he handled sledging subjects with the vigour of a professional who knew all there was to be known about a sledging life. Scott and Wilson worked hand in hand to further the scientific objects of the expedition. For Scott, though no specialist in any one branch, had a most genuine love of science. "Science, the rock foundation of all effort," he wrote, and whether discussing ice problems with Wright, meteorology with Simpson, or geology with Taylor, he showed not only a mind which was receptive and keen to learn, but a knowledge which was quick to offer valuable suggestions. I remember Pennell condemning anything but scientific learning in dealing with the problems round us. No guesswork was his argument, but he emphatically made an exception of Scott, who had an uncanny knack of hitting upon a solution. Over and over again in his diary we can read of the interest he took in pure and applied science, and it is doubtful whether this side of an expedition in high northern or southern latitudes has ever been more fortunate in their leader. Wilson's own share in the scientific results is more obvious because he was the director of the work, but no published reports will give an adequate idea of the ability he showed in co-ordinating the various interests of a varied community, nor of the tact he displayed in dealing with the difficulties which arose. Above all, his judgment was excellent, and Scott as well as the rest of us relied upon him to a very great extent. The value of judgment in a land where a wrong decision may mean disaster as well as loss of life is beyond all price. Weather in which changes are most sudden is a case in point. Also the state of sea ice, the direction to be followed in difficult country when sledging, the best way of taking crevassed areas when they must be crossed, and all the ways by which the maximum of result may be combined with the minimum of danger in a land where nature is sometimes almost too big an enemy to fight. All this wants judgment and, if possible, experience. Wilson could supply both, for his experience was as wide as that of Scott, and I have constantly known Scott change his mind after a talk with Bill. For the rest I give quotations from Scott's diary. "He has had a hand in almost every lecture given, and has been consulted in almost every effort which has been made towards the solution of the practical or theoretical problems of our polar world."
And again,
"Words must always fail me when I talk of Bill Wilson. I believe he really is the finest character I ever met. The closer one gets to him, the more there is to admire. Every quality is so solid and dependable. Cannot you imagine how that counts down here? Whatever the matter, one knows Bill will be sound, shrewdly practical, intensely loyal, and quite unselfish. Add to this a wider knowledge of persons and things than is at first guessable, a quiet vein of humour, and a really consummate tact, and you have some idea of his values. I think he is the most popular member of the party, and that is saying much."
And at the end, when Scott himself lay dying, he wrote to Mrs. Wilson:
"I can do no more to comfort you than to tell you that he died as he lived, a brave, true man, the best of comrades and staunchest of friends."
Physically, Scott had been a delicate boy, but developed into a strong man, 5 feet 9 inches in height, 11 stone 6 pounds in weight, with a chest measurement of 39¼ inches. Wilson was not a particularly strong man. On leaving with the Discovery he was but lately cured of consumption, yet he went with Scott to his farthest south, and helped to get Shackleton back alive. Shackleton owed his life to those two. Wilson was of a slimmer, more athletic build, a great walker, 5 feet 10½ inches in height, 11 stones in weight, with a chest measurement of 36 inches. He was an ideal example of my contention, which I believe can be proved many times over to be a fact, that it is not strength of body, but rather strength of will, which carries a man farthest where mind and body are taxed at the same time to their utmost limit. Scott was 43 years of age at his death, and Wilson 39. Bowers was of a very different build. Aged 28, he was only 5 feet 4 inches in height, while his chest measurement, which I give more as a general guide to his physique than for any other reason, was 40 inches, and his weight 12 stones. He was recommended to Scott by Sir Clements Markham, who was dining one day with Captain Wilson Barker on the Worcester, on which ship Bowers was trained. Bowers was then home from India, and the talk turned to the Antarctic. Wilson Barker turned to Sir Clements in the course of conversation, and alluding to Bowers, said, "Here is a man who will be leading one of those expeditions some day." He lived a rough life after passing from the Worcester into the merchant service, sailing 5 times round the world in the Loch Torridon. Thence he passed into the service of the Royal Indian Marine, commanded a river gunboat on the Irrawaddy, and afterwards served on HMS Fox, where he had considerable experience, often in open boats, preventing the gun running which was carried on by the Afghans in the Persian Gulf. Thence he came to us. It is at any rate a curious fact, and it may be a significant one, that Bowers, who enjoyed a greater resistance to cold than any man on this expedition, joined it direct from one of the hottest places on the globe. My knowledge is insufficient to say whether it is possible that any trace can be found here of cause and effect, especially since the opposite seems to be the more common experience, in that such people as return from India to England generally find the English winter trying. I give the fact for what it may be worth, remarking only that the cold of an English winter is generally damp, while that of the Antarctic is dry, so far as any rate as the atmosphere is concerned. Bowers himself always professed the greatest indifference not only to cold but also to heat, and his indifference was not that of a poser, as many experiences will show. At the same time he was temperamentally one who refused to admit difficulties. Indeed, if he did not actually welcome them, he greeted them with scorn, and in scorning went far to master them. Scott believed that difficulties were made to be overcome. Bowers certainly believed that he was the man to overcome them. This self-confidence was based on a very deep and broad religious feeling, and carried conviction with it. The men swore by him both on the ship and ashore. "He's all right," was their judgment of his seamanship, which was admirable. "I like being with Birdie, because I always know where I am," was the remark made to me by an officer one evening as we pitched the tent. We had just been spending some time in picking up a depôt, which a less able man might well have missed. As he was one of the 2 or 3 greatest friends of my life, I found it hard to give the reader a mental picture of Birdie Bowers, which will not appear extravagant. There were times when his optimism appeared forced and formal, though I believe it was not really so. There were times when I have almost hated him for his infernal cheerfulness. To those accustomed to judge men by the standards of their fashionable and corseted drawing-rooms, Bowers appeared crude. "You couldn't kill that man if you took a poleaxe to him," was the comment of a New Zealander at a dance at Christchurch. Such men may be at a discount in conventional life, but give me a snowy ice floe waving about on top of a black swell, a ship thrown aback, a sledge party almost shattered, or one that has just upset their supper onto the floorcloth of the tent, which is much the same thing, and I will lie down and cry for Bowers to come and lead me to food and safety. Those whom the gods love die young. The gods loved him, if indeed it be benevolent to show your favourites a clear, straight, shining path of life, with plenty of discomfort and not a little pain, but with few doubts and no fears. Browning might well have had Bowers in mind when he wrote of one who never turned his back, but marched breast forward, never doubted clouds would break, never dreamed, though right were worsted, wrong would triumph. Held we fall to rise, are baffled to fight better, sleep to wake. There was nothing subtle about him. He was transparently simple, straightforward and unselfish. His capacity for work was prodigious, and when his own work happened to take less than his full time, he characteristically found activity in serving a scientist or exercising an animal. So he used to help to send up balloons with self-recording instruments attached to them, and track the threads which led to them when detached. He was responsible for putting up the 3 outlying meteorological screens, and read them more often than anybody else. At times he looked after some of the dogs, because at the moment there was nobody else whose proper job it happened to be, and he took a particular fancy to one of our strongest huskies, called Krisravitsa, which is the Russian, so I am told, for most beautiful. This fancy originated in a fact that to Chris, as the most truculent of our untamed devils, fell a large share of well-deserved punishment. A living thing in trouble, be it dog or man, was something to be helped. Being the smallest man in the party, he schemed to have allotted to him the largest pony available, both for the depot and polar journeys. Their exercise, when he succeeded, was a matter for experiment, for his knowledge of horses was as limited as his love of animals was intense. He started to exercise his second pony, for the first was lost on the floe, by riding him. "I'll soon get used to him," he said one day, when Victor had just deposited him in the tide crack. "To say nothing of his getting used to me," he added in a more subdued voice. This was open-air work, and as such more congenial than that which had to be done inside the hut, but his most important work was indoors, and he brought to it just the same restless enthusiasm which allowed no leisure for reading or relaxation. He joined as one of the ship's officers in London. Given charge of the stores, the way in which he stowed the ship aroused the admiration of even the stevedores, especially when he fell down the main hatch one morning onto the pig iron below, recovered consciousness in about half a minute, and continued to work for the rest of the day as though nothing had happened. As the voyage out proceeded, it became obvious that his knowledge of the stores and undefeatable personality would be of great value to the shore party, and it was decided that he should land, to his great delight. He was personally responsible for all food supplies, whether for home consumption or for sledging, for all sledging stores and the distribution of weights, the loading of sledges, the consumption of coal, the issue of clothing, boatswain's stores, and carpenter's stores. Incidentally, the keeper of stores wanted a very exact knowledge of the cases which contained them, for the drifts of snow soon buried them as they lay in the camp outside. As time proved his capacity, Scott left one thing after another in Bowers' hands. Scott was a leader of men, and it is a good quality in such to delegate work from themselves on to those who prove their power to shoulder the burden. Undoubtedly Bowers saved Scott a great deal of work, and gave him time, which he might not otherwise have been able to spare, to interest himself in the scientific work of the station, greatly to its benefit, and do a good deal of useful writing. The 2 ways in which Bowers helped Scott most this winter were in the preparation of the plans and the working out of the weights of the southern journey, which shall be discussed later, and in the routine work of the station, for which he was largely responsible, and which ran so smoothly that I am unable to tell the reader how the stores were issued, or the dinner settled, by what rule the working parties for fetching ice for water and other kindred jobs about the camp were ordered. They just happened, and I don't know how. I only know that Bowers had the bunk above mine in the hut, and that when I was going to sleep he was generally standing on a chair and using his own bunk as a desk, and I conclude from the numerous list of stores and weights which are now in my hands that these were being produced. Anyway, the job was done, and the fact that we knew nothing about it goes far to prove how efficiently it was carried through. For him difficulties simply did not exist. I have never known a more buoyant, virile nature. Scott's writing abound in references to the extraordinary value he placed upon his help, and after the share which he took in the depôt and winter journeys, it was clear that he would probably be taken in the Polar Party, as indeed proved to be the case. No man of that party better deserved the place.
I believe he is the hardest traveller that ever undertook a polar journey, as well as one of the most undaunted.
The standard is high. Bowers gave us 2 of our best lectures, the first on the evolution of sledge foods, at the end of which he discussed our own rations on the depôt journey, and made suggestions which he had worked out scientifically for those of the polar journey. His arguments were sound enough to disarm the hostility, if not to convert to his opinions at least one scientist who had come to hear him strongly of the opinion that an untrained man should not discuss so complex a subject. The second lecture, on the evolution of polar clothing, was also the fruit of much work. The general conclusion come to, and this was after the winter journey, was that our own clothing and equipment could not be bettered in any important respect, though it must be always understood that the expedition wore windproof clothing and not furs, except for hands and feet. When man-hauling, windproof, I am convinced, cannot be improved upon, but for dog driving in cold weather I suspect that furs may be better. The table was cleared after supper, and we sat round it for these lectures 3 times a week. There was no compulsion about them, and the seamen only turned up for those which especially interested them, such as Meare's vivid account of his journeyings on the eastern or Chinese borderland of Tibet. This land is inhabited by the 18 tribes, the original inhabitants of Tibet, who were driven out by the present inhabitants, and Meares told us chiefly of the Lolos who killed his companion Brooke after having persuaded him that they were friendly and anxious to help him.
He had no pictures and very makeshift maps, yet he held us really entranced for nearly 2 hours by the sheer interest of his adventures. The spirit of the wanderer is in Meare's blood. He has no happiness but in the wild places of the earth. I have never met so extreme of a type. Even now he is looking forward to getting away by himself to Hut Point, tired already of our scant measure of civilization.
3 lectures a week were too many in the opinion of the majority. The second winter, with our very reduced company, we had 2 a week, and I feel sure that this was an improvement. No officer nor seaman, however, could have had too many of Ponting's lectures, which gave us glimpses into many lands, illustrated by his own inimitable slides. Thus we lived every now and then for a short hour in Burma, India, or Japan, in scenes of trees and flowers and feminine charm, which were the very antithesis of our present situation, and we were all the better for it. Ponting also illustrated the subjects of other lectures with home-made slides of photographs taken during the autumn or from printed books. But for the most part the lecturers were perforce content with designs and plans drawn on paper and pinned one on top of the other upon a large drawing board propped up on the table and torn off sheet by sheet. From the practical point of view the most interesting evening to us was that on which Scott produced the plan of the southern journey. The reader may ask why this was not really prepared until the winter previous to the journey itself, and the answer clearly is that it was impossible to arrange more than a rough idea until the autumn sledging had taught its lesson in food, equipment, relative reliability of dogs, ponies and men, and until the changes and chances of our life showed exactly what transport would be available for the following sledging season. Thus it was with lively anticipation that we sat down on May the 8th, an advisory committee as it were, to hear and give our suggestions on the scheme which Scott had evolved in the early weeks of the winter after the adventures of the depôt journey and the loss of 6 ponies. It was on just such a winter night too that Scott read his interesting paper on the ice barrier and inland ice, which will probably form the basis for all future work on these subjects. The barrier, he maintained, is probably afloat, and covers at least 5 times the extent of the North Sea, with an average thickness of some 400 feet, though it has only been possible to get the very roughest of levels. According to the movement of a depôt laid in the Discovery days, the barrier moved 608 yards towards the open Ross Sea in 13½ months. It must be admitted that the inclination of the ice sheet is not sufficient to cause this, and the old idea that the glacier streams flowing down from inland plateau provide the necessary impetus is imperfect. It was Simpson's suggestion that the deposition of snow on the barrier leads to an expansion due to the increase of weight. Some admittedly vague ideas as to the extent and character of the inland ice sheet ended a clever and convincing paper, which contained a lot of good reasoning. Simpson proved an excellent lecturer, and in meteorology and in the explanation of the many instruments with which his corner of the hut was full, he possessed subjects which interested and concerned everybody. Nelson on biological problems and Taylor on physiography were always interesting.
Taylor, I dreamt of your lecture last night. How could I live so long in the world and not know something of so fascinating a subject?
Thus Scott on the morning following one of these lectures. Wright on ice problems, radium, and the origin of matter had highly technical subjects, which left many of us somewhat befogged. But Atkinson on scurvy had an audience each member of which felt that he had a personal interest in the subject under discussion. Indeed, one of his hearers was to suffer the advanced stage of this dread disease within 6 months. Atkinson inclined to Almroth Wright's theory that scurvy is due to an acid intoxication of the blood caused by bacteria. He described the litmus paper test, which was practised on us monthly, and before and after sledge journeys. In this the blood of each individual is drawn, and various strengths of dilute sulphuric acid are added to it until it is neutralized, the healthy man showing normal 30 to 50, while the man with scorbutic signs will be normal 50 to 90, according to the stage to which he has reached. The only thing which is certain to stop scurvy is fresh vegetables. Fresh meat when life is otherwise under extreme conditions will not do so, an instance being the siege of Paris, when they had plenty of horse meat. In 1795 voyages were being ruined by scurvy, and Anson lost 300 out of 500 men. But in that year the first discoveries were made, and lime juice was introduced by Blaine. From this time scurvy practically disappeared from the Navy, and there was little scurvy in Nelson's days. But the reason is not clear, since, according to modern research, lime juice only helps to prevent it. It continued in the merchant service, and in a decade from about 1865 some 400 cases were admitted into the Dreadnought Hospital, whereas in the decade 1887 to 1896 there were only 38 cases. We had at Cape Evans a salt of sodium to be used to alkalise the blood as an experiment, if necessity arose. Darkness, cold, and hard work are in Atkinson's opinion important causes of scurvy. Nansen was an advocate of variety of diet as being antiscorbutic, and Scott recalled a story told him by Nansen which he had never understood. It appeared that some men had eaten tins of tainted food. Some of it was slightly tainted, some of it was really bad. They rejected the really bad ones and ate those only which were slightly tainted. And of course, said Nansen, they should have eaten the worst. I have since asked Nansen about this story. He tells me that he must have been referring to the crew of the Windward, the ship of the Jackson-Harmsworth expedition to Franz Josef Land in 1894-97. The crew of this ship, which was travelling to and from civilization, got scurvy, though the land party kept healthy. Of this Jackson writes: "In the case of the crew of the Windward, I fear that there was a considerable carelessness in the use of tinned meats that were not free from taint, although tins quite gone were rejected. We, on shore, largely used fresh bear's meat, and the crew of the Windward were also allowed as much as they could be induced to eat. They, however, preferred tinned meat several days a week to a diet of bear's meat alone, and some of the crew had such a prejudice against bear's meat as to refuse to eat it at all." Of course tainted food should not have been eaten at all, but if it had to be eaten, then according to Nansen the ptomaines which cause scurvy in the earlier stages of decomposition are destroyed by the ferment which forms in the later stages. They should therefore have taken the worst tins, if any at all. Wilson was strongly of opinion that fresh meat alone would stop scurvy. On the Discovery seal meat cured it. As to scurvy on Scott's Discovery Southern journey, he made light of it. However, during the winter journey I remember Wilson stating that Shackleton several times fell in a faint as he got outside the tent, and he seems to have been seriously ill. Wilson knew that he himself had scurvy some time before the others knew it, because the discoloration of his gums did not show in front for some time. He did not think their dogs on that journey had scurvy, but ptomaine poisoning from fish which had travelled through the tropics. He was of opinion that on returning from sledge journeys on the Discovery they had wrongly attributed to scurvy such symptoms as rash on the body, swollen legs and ankles, which were rather the result of excessive fatigue. I may add that we had these signs on our return from the winter journey. End of Chapter 6, Part 3.